Very well. Good morning, Council. Let's see. First order of business. I have communicated to Chief Judge Kaczynski, in light of the Supreme Court decision yesterday, that I am requesting that this case be withdrawn from the Ninth Circuit pilot project. And he indicated that he would approve that request, so that should take care of the broadcasting matter. And we have motions that have been filed on behalf of Mr. Garlow and Mr. McPherson. And the clerk informs me counsel for those parties are here present.
Correct, Your Honor.
All right, fine.
Vincent McCarthy, Your Honor. I was admitted pro vice in this court very recently.
Yes, I believe I signed that yesterday or the day before.
I understand.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
You've got quite a lineup of lawyers here.
I understand, yes.
Why don't you use the microphone?
Sorry, I wanted to ask for Your Honor's guidance as to, I spoke to the counsel for the plaintiffs and they said they wouldn't be calling my clients until at least next week. And I wanted to know if Your Honor knew when he was going to make the decision on our motion to quash, because I wanted to remain for that if it's going to be made now. If Your Honor is going to wait until the witnesses are called, I'll just go back to my office and then return at that time.
Mr. Boutros, are you handling this for the plaintiffs?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, in discussions with counsel, I suggested that once we have had a chance to review the documents being produced in this rolling production by the proponents, we would have the universe of documents relating to his clients. We would try to work out with the proponents an agreement that would allow us not to have to call counsel's clients to testify and authenticate the documents. That's the main reason why we would need them. And we have several documents that we have now found in this new production that relates to those individuals who filed motions to quash. What I propose is we look at the documents, we'd figure it out, talk to the proponent's counsel, see if we could work out an arrangement that would allow us to simply to move them into evidence without these individuals having to come and testify.
As a consequence, you may be able to handle this matter between yourselves.
In short, yes.
All right.
Thank you, Your Honor. So we will be in touch, and then if we need to come back, we'll do it Tuesday.
If you need to come back, alert counsel, and let the clerk know when you need to see us, and we will take care of the matter.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I appreciate it. All right. Let's see. We are ready, I believe, with the next witness, and you indicated who that witness is?
Yes.
And who is going to be presenting him?
Dr. Edmund Egan, Your Honor, and my name is Kristin Van Aken.
Ms. Redican?
Van Aken, capital V-A-N, capital A-K-E-N.
All right. Please, call your next witness.
Plaintiffs and plaintiff intervenors call, plaintiff intervenor calls Dr. Edmund A. Egan to testify.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. State your name, please.
My name is Edmund A. Egan.
And spell your last name.
E-G-A-N.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Egan.
Good morning.
I'm going to publish a slide that summarizes. It's a simple demonstrative slide of some of your credentials, and then we'll talk about those. Dr. Egan, what is your current position?
I'm the chief economist in the Comptroller's office in San Francisco.
And what is your role, briefly, in that position?
I direct the Office of Economic Analysis, which is a division within the Comptroller's office and is responsible for preparing economic impact analysis for pending legislation.
Dr. Egan, we'll talk more about that experience and that role in a little while, but tell me a little bit more about your prior professional experience in the area of urban and regional economic policy.
Immediately before joining San Francisco, the city and the county in 2007, I worked for a consulting firm known as ICF International, where I did a number of consulting projects related to economic development strategy and analysis in North America and globally.
Can you give me a couple of examples, Dr. Egan?
In the late 1990s, for example, I worked on the economic development strategy for the City of Toronto. And just before joining San Francisco, I worked as a consultant on the City of San Francisco's economic development plan.
Have you ever taught at the university level, Dr. Egan?
Yes, I have.
And can you tell me about that experience, please?
I'm currently an adjunct faculty member at the University of California at Berkeley. I teach city and regional planning. I teach in the City and Regional Planning Department at that university.
Do you teach undergraduates, Dr. Egan?
I teach graduate students.
And speaking generally, what kinds of courses do you teach graduate students at UC Berkeley?
I teach in the field of regional economic development and in urban and city regional planning departments. Since fall of 2004, each fall I've taught a course called the Urban and Regional Economy, which is a review of, well, a theoretical review of key things in regional and urban economics to master's and PhD students.
And do you have any academic articles that you've published?
I've published 3 peer-reviewed academic articles when I was in graduate school and also subsequently as a consultant.
Do those articles deal with the field of urban and regional economic analysis, economic policy?
Yes, all of them did.
And can you tell me what's the highest level of education that you've received?
I have a PhD degree.
Where did you receive your PhD degree?
From the University of California at Berkeley.
Okay. Dr. Egan, there is no binder in front of you, but there should be. So let me correct that. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Egan, would you take a look at the exhibit marked PX2324 behind the tab so marked? Do you recognize that document, Dr. Egan?
Yes, I do.
What is that document?
That's my CV.
Your Honor, I would move that Exhibit 2324, Plaintiff's Exhibit 2324, be moved into evidence.
There being no objection, 2324 is admitted.
And Dr. Egan, that CV represents accurately your professional and academic experience.
Yes, it does.
Let's talk a little bit more about your role as chief economist in San Francisco. You told me that you direct the Office of Economic Analysis. What does that office do?
Our local legislative body, the Board of Supervisors, receives all legislation that's introduced by the mayor or by members of that board. And my office reviews that legislation after each meeting to determine if any of it would have a material economic impact on San Francisco. And if we make the determination that it would, we report on that impact, detailing this extent of the economic impact before the board acts on that legislation in committee.
So what is the intent of those reports with respect to the board's action in committee?
It's to ensure that the Board of Supervisors has a full understanding of the economic impact of the decisions that they make.
How is it that you and your office decide whether a piece of pending legislation could have a material economic impact?
Well, there are a number of things that we look for. Among them are in the legislation that it has a real regulatory power, that it actually affects the behavior of individuals in the city and economic agents, such as businesses. And we trace through how the legislation would constrain their behavior and how that would change their economic activity, and then try to quantify that. As a general rule of thumb, if we believe that legislation would have greater than a $10 million impact on the city's economy, we would report on that.
And when you say you would report on that, is there a product or a written report that you produce?
Yes. We prepare written reports as well as do verbal oral presentations of our findings.
And what kinds of sources of information do you rely on in preparing those economic, what are they called, those reports?
Economic impact reports.
And what sorts of sources do you rely on in preparing economic impact reports for the Board of Supervisors?
We're greatly reliant on government statistical data from the state and from the federal governments. We also, I believe in almost every report, rely upon data generated by city departments to make quantitative estimates of the impact. We also rely on information that's provided from us from people who work in the city, sometimes people who work in the private sector in San Francisco, and others.
And do you rely on research generally beyond the data sets that you described?
Yes, we try to rely on research other than that data, particularly when it pertains to similar legislation or similar issues occurring in other places.
And Dr. Egan, these economic impact reports, are they documents concerning urban economic policy, speaking generally?
Yes, they are.
Relied on by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors?
That's correct.
Your Honor, I would tender Dr. Egan as an expert in urban and regional economic policy.
Very well, voir dire.
No, Your Honor.
I beg your pardon?
No.
No voir dire? Very well. And you accept Dr. Egan as an opinion witness in the field for which he's been designated, correct?
Yes.
Very well.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Egan, let's turn now to your work in the context of this case. And I want to ask you if you have undertaken an analysis of the effects of the prohibition on the marriage of same-sex couples on San Francisco's economy and its governmental costs and revenues.
Yes, I have.
And Dr. Egan, tell me, is that analysis that you undertook similar to or different from the kinds of analysis that you do as chief economist for San Francisco?
Well, it's quite similar to the kinds of analysis we do in our daily work. The only difference being was that we don't normally review state legislation. We only review city legislation.
And when you considered that analysis, did you look for positive as well as negative economic impacts that the prohibition might have?
Well, I think you look for impacts. You look for ways in which the regulation affects people's behavior. Whether that winds up being positive or negative is kind of an analytical conclusion.
Speaking generally, did you reach any conclusions after undertaking that analysis?
Yes, I did. I've identified several ways in which the prohibition of marriages of same-sex couples would have a negative impact on San Francisco and also negatively affect the city's revenues and overall budget.
And can some of these conclusions about the negative economic impact on San Francisco and its budget and revenues be generalized to other jurisdictions?
I believe that they could, although I haven't specifically studied other jurisdictions.
Okay. Okay, let's turn now to some specific areas where I believe you have opinions. And I would like to pull up a demonstrative slide. Great. Dr. Egan, do you have any opinions concerning the relationship between the prohibition on same-sex marriage, wealth generation, and city revenue?
Yes, I do.
Speaking generally, what is that conclusion?
In general, because of the ways in which marriage affects people's patterns of wealth generation over their life, if same-sex marriage were legalized, San Francisco would see an increase in sales tax revenue and an increase in property tax revenue in the future.
Using this demonstrative, can you explain to me the relationship between legalizing marriage and the increase in married couples?
Yes. If marriage among same-sex couples were legalized, I predict we would see an increase in the number of married couples in San Francisco. There's a significant amount of research in economics that looks at the impact of marital status on wealth accumulation over the life of an individual. And to put it simply, what it finds, and as I understand it, is that married individuals, tend to accumulate more wealth than single individuals. So to the extent that there are more married people and fewer single people in San Francisco, we would see greater wealth accumulated within the city.
Dr. Egan, what are the impacts of that greater wealth accumulation within the city or on San Francisco?
They have two main impacts. People with higher wealth tend to have higher income. As that wealth generates dividends, that leads to higher spending on consumer goods in San Francisco. It would also tend to increase the value of real estate within San Francisco, as we would have more wealth essentially bidding for the same amount of land.
And what are the impacts on San Francisco's budgets or revenues?
Well, higher consumer spending in San Francisco from a wealthier population leads to an increase in sales tax revenue, since the city gets a percentage of all consumer spending in the city. And greater value of real estate in San Francisco leads to an increase in property tax revenues because we also get a percentage of the assessed value of each property.
Dr. Egan, is there any way you can tell us about the magnitude of these potential impacts?
Not in any strong quantitative sense. We would need to project over time first what the increase in married couples would be, which might not be that challenging, but projecting the increase in wealth accumulation and how much that would translate into spending is a challenging exercise. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's challenging.
And you have not attempted to do so here?
I have not attempted to do so here.
To the extent that San Francisco sees an increase in sales tax revenue and property tax revenue, is that also an impact that you would expect other jurisdictions within California to also see?
Other jurisdictions within California would actually benefit simply from the San Francisco effect. For example, the state of California gets a percentage of the sales tax that is generated within San Francisco, and other local government entities get a percentage of the property tax value.
Dr. Egan, let's turn now to the next slide. And this is a demonstrative concerning, it's entitled, Healthy Behaviors Impact on City Revenue. Do you have an opinion about the relationship between marriage healthy behavior and San Francisco's revenue?
Yes, I do. My opinion is that legalizing same-sex marriage would encourage healthier behavior, and that would ultimately lead to higher payroll tax revenue and a reduction in public health costs in San Francisco.
You've already explained to us the increase in married couples that you project. What relationship do you see between an increase in married couples and increased healthy behavior from individuals?
Well, there's also a number of articles in the economics literature that look at the connection between marital status and healthy behavior, and essentially finding that married individuals are healthier on average, and in particular behave themselves in healthier ways than single individuals. That has economic consequences of two kinds.
State those consequences, please.
Certainly. There's also a well-known connection in economics between health of the workforce and workforce productivity, which takes many forms in practice. The simple of which is lower rates of absenteeism due to illness. Higher workforce productivity affects workers' wages through the marketplace, and that directly ties to a local revenue we have in San Francisco, our payroll tax. So, the more wages that are earned in San Francisco, the more payroll tax that's earned by the city and by the county.
So there's a general link between worker productivity and an increase in payroll taxes.
Yes, there is via higher wages. Higher productivity leads to higher wages, and higher wages leads to higher payroll tax revenue for the city. And healthier behavior is also associated with less reliance on the healthcare system, including the public healthcare system. And therefore, to the extent that the population of San Francisco adopts healthier behaviors over time due to marriage, the city's public health care costs would decline, and that would result in a cost savings for the city and county.
What is the magnitude of the city's spending on public health in your understanding?
The city's general fund contribution to public health is in the neighborhood of $364 million, I think, dollars per year.
Dr. Egan, can you tell us how great a savings we would see if we lifted the prohibition on same-sex marriage with respect to public health?
I have not attempted to quantify this either because some of the same challenges, taking an estimate of the number of married couples and translating that into healthier behavior and the specific connections between productivity and less demand for health care are challenging to quantify. I think that they could be quantified, but I have not attempted to do so.
Dr. Egan, you also explained the relationship between payroll tax and productivity along with the reduction in public health costs. Would either of those impacts be seen by other jurisdictions in California, in your view, if the prohibition on the marriage of same-sex couples were lifted?
Relatively few jurisdictions in California have a payroll tax. However, many jurisdictions do have a business tax, and to the extent that higher worker productivity results in stronger business performance, which I think is a very reasonable assumption to make, that would lead to higher business tax revenues for those jurisdictions.
Okay, I want to ask you whether you are aware of any relationship between increased healthy behaviors and domestic partnership.
I have not seen any research on that subject.
Well, would you assume with me for a moment that domestic partnership has the same effect on healthy behavior as marriage does, and then assume further that domestic partnership is an option for same-sex couples, but marriage is not? Would we still expect to see this impact on city revenue simply from having domestic partnership?
I think that you would see an impact on city revenue, but it would not be as great as it would if same-sex marriage were legalized. And the basis for that opinion is that I believe, based on what I've reviewed in the way of research, is that more individuals would select marriage, more same-sex couples would elect to be married than would elect to register as domestic partners. And so those benefits would essentially affect a greater number of people, and you would have a larger number of people in San Francisco who would be benefiting from healthy behaviors, or in an institution that promotes healthy behaviors.
So you would expect a greater impact on San Francisco's budget or revenue or spending from marriage rather than domestic partnership.
That's correct.
Dr. Egan, let's look at another aspect of your opinions about health. Have you looked at the relationship between the uninsured population, the prohibition on marriage, and the city's expenditures?
Yes, I have.
And can you tell me what that relationship is in your view?
Yes, essentially, legalizing same-sex marriage would ultimately increase the number of people who had health insurance in San Francisco. And that would reduce the cost of the city and county in serving the uninsured, which would result in cost savings for both the city and the county.
And what is your basis for believing that legalizing marriage would cause more companies, would reduce the number of uninsured people and cause a greater health insurance coverage in San Francisco?
In my opinion, if same-sex marriage were legalized, same-sex couples would elect that option. And more companies would extend benefits to those couples as married couples than do currently. That would reduce the number of uninsured people in San Francisco, as at the moment there are individuals in San Francisco who are in same-sex partnerships where their partner is covered and they are not covered. Their partner is covered by employer health care and they are not. If that number of people was reduced, that would be less uninsured people in San Francisco, and that would reduce the local burden on covering the uninsured.
Dr. Egan, can you take a look at the tab marked PX2260 in your binder, please?
I'm sorry, the number again is?
2660, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Would you review that and let me know if you've ever seen that document before?
Yes, I have seen it before.
And in what context did you see this document, Dr. Egan?
This document was provided to me a few days ago by Greg Sass, who is an official in our Department of Public Health in San Francisco.
Is Mr. Sass someone with whom you regularly communicate as chief economist about analysis that the Office of Economic Analysis is performing?
I've spoken to Mr. Sass before, and he's the type of official with whom I would regularly talk about issues concerning his field.
Your Honor, I move PX2260 into evidence.
Your Honor, we object. This was not a document that was considered by Dr. Egan in his expert report.
Your Honor, this is a document that did not exist at the time Mr. Egan was preparing his expert report. It was something that we received a few days ago, and it's merely illustrative of his opinion.
When did you produce this to the proponents?
It was produced shortly after we received it. I believe a couple of weeks ago, and it was also disclosed, I believe, on Sunday night as a document that we were going to use in examining Dr. Egan.
Anything further, Mr. Patterson?
Dr. Egan, they never submitted a supplemental declaration from Dr. Egan saying that he was going to consider this document as part of his opinions. And we have no way of determining whether or not it's authentic. They have not laid a foundation for it. We don't know where Greg Sass obtained the document.
Well, let me reserve on that. Let's have the witness lay some additional foundation. I gather you were provided a copy of this document Sunday evening.
Yes.
And since the document appears to have been created on December 30th, 2009, it would have been hard to have produced it much before then. So in any event, let's see how this goes, and we'll make a ruling after some additional foundation is laid.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Egan, let's talk a little bit about this document and see if we can satisfy the concerns. In your understanding, what is the effect of this letter that purports to be sent by the national elevator industry?
Where did it come from? Foundation.
Okay. Well, you shared with us that you received it from Greg Sass. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did Dr. Sass give you, or Mr. Sass, I'm not sure of his degree, give you any information about the document when he provided it to you?
He did not. He emailed it to me and did not provide any additional information beyond the fact that it might be important for me to consider in my testimony.
And did he give you any reasons why it might be important for you to consider?
No, he did not.
Had he previously given you information in the course of helping you prepare for your testimony?
Yes, he did.
What information did he previously provide you?
He answered a number of questions I had about the extent of San Francisco's investment in public health or expenditures on public health, and in particular its expenditures on the uninsured, if I recall.
So assuming that this letter illustrates something about testimony that you're giving today, is that the kind of information that you would regularly rely on, information provided to you from department officials in preparing economic impact reports for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I would offer this under Rule of Evidence 703. It is simply helpful to the expert's testimony. It is helpful to his opinion. And it's certainly not prejudicial in any way to proponents.
Anything further, Mr. Patterson?
Your Honor, we maintain our objections based on we still don't have assurance that this is an authentic document or where it came from beyond him receiving it from Greg Sass.
All right. I'll admit it for what value it has. It appears to be a national elevator industry benefit plan description. The connections to these proceedings is a little uncertain in my mind at the moment, but let's see how you can tie it up.
I think I can do that in one question, Your Honor.
All right.
Dr. Egan, What, in your view, is the import of this letter with respect to the issues we've been discussing concerning uninsured same-sex partners in San Francisco?
It's my understanding that this document details a change in policy by the national elevator industry insofar as it treats same-sex spouses as far as benefits are concerned. And specifically, they're detailing that they have changed their policy, which used to be that same-sex spouses were not covered because a spouse referred only to a person of the opposite sex, who is husband or wife. And they've used the reference to a person of the opposite sex, but now they offer benefits to any spouse.
Do they offer benefits to domestic partners, assuming the information in this letter is correct?
There is nothing in this letter in reference to domestic partnership.
Does this illustrate the phenomenon we were just discussing, that companies typically will offer some benefits to married partners, but will not necessarily offer those benefits to domestic partners?
Yes, I believe it does.
Okay. So let's go back to this analysis then. In your opinion, we have more companies extending benefits to same-sex partners under a marriage regime. And what is the import of that for San Francisco?
Well, if more individuals are covered by their spouse's employer health care plan, that would reduce the number of people who are uninsured in San Francisco. And that would essentially reduce the burden of the city and county of San Francisco to provide health care to the uninsured.
Dr. Egan, can you tell us how much that burden will be reduced if marriage were legal for same-sex couples?
That's a difficult thing to quantify because we don't precisely know how many individuals right now are in that category where they are in a same-sex relationship. They're unmarried and one partner is covered and the other is not. So we don't kind of know what the universe looks like. So we don't know how many people would be out of that situation if they were able to be married.
Do you know anything about the denominator, the size of the potential pool of dollars that are affected?
We do know that the city and county spends about $177 million a year on providing health care for the uninsured.
And it's your opinion that that would be reduced if more people had health insurance?
That's correct.
Okay. Dr. Egan, can you tell me anything about whether other local governments in San Francisco could see the same effect?
You mean other local governments outside of San Francisco?
Thank you. I sometimes take the San Francisco-centric view. But please, tell me about that.
I think this principle would work more broadly than in San Francisco. For example, I just noticed that national elevator industry from this document is based in Pennsylvania. This is not simply a San Francisco-centric thing. The companies would provide benefits to all married couples, and therefore you would see this reduction of the uninsured throughout the country.
And what is the role within California, at least, of local governments in providing health services to the uninsured?
I'm not sure I can speak to their precise statutory role, but I know that every county in California provides extensive services to the uninsured, and the state funds a great deal of that.
Let's look at some other health and health spending impacts. I've put up another demonstrative concerning behavior and mental health services, and I'd like you to tell me if you have an opinion about a relationship between spending on behavioral health services and the prohibition on same-sex marriage.
Yes, I do.
What is that opinion, Dr. Egan?
I believe that if marriage among same-sex couples were legalized, the city, over the long term, would see a reduction in its costs for providing behavioral health services and the physical health services that can be allied to that.
Okay. Let's talk about the basis for that opinion. I see here a connection between legalizing marriage and reducing discrimination against, I assume the LGBT is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What's your basis for believing there is such a relationship?
I believe that prohibition of marriage for same-sex couples is a form of discrimination. And I believe that it's reasonable to assume that if the prohibition were removed, there would be, over time, a lessening of the discrimination that those individuals experience in society and in their daily lives.
Assuming that to be true, what is the relationship between reduced discrimination and public health spending on behavioral health services?
When I was preparing my report, I spoke with an individual in the public health department who talked to me about the uptake of behavioral health services by gay and lesbian people in San Francisco. And I was told that their use of these services is disproportionately high. And one of the reasons for that is discrimination. Consequently, I believe if the discrimination they experience was lessened, their disproportionate use of these services would be lessened, and that would ultimately result in a cost savings for San Francisco.
Can you tell us how big that cost savings would be?
Well, it's quite challenging because how much of the additional demand is due to discrimination is hard to quantify. We also don't know the exact amount that gay and lesbian individuals require of the city's behavioral health services. One thing we do know is that the city spends $2.5 million a year for specialized services for LGBT populations, but that doesn't consider the use by gay and lesbian people of all of the general, non-specialized services within behavioral health in San Francisco.
And what is the size of the potential public health expenditure we are talking about in San Francisco?
Well, again, the city spends around $360 million a year on public health.
Would other jurisdictions see a similar effect if you were correct about the effect that San Francisco would see?
In proportion to their gay and lesbian population and to the extent that they also see disproportionate use of those services because of discrimination, I would expect to see that in other jurisdictions, yes.
Okay. Let's talk about school funding for a moment. Do you have any opinion about the relationship between the prohibition on marriage and the impact of that on local school district funding?
Yes, I do.
What is that opinion, Dr. Egan?
In my opinion, if the marriage of same-sex couples were legalized, we would see an increase in school district revenue in San Francisco and potentially in other jurisdictions in California.
Let's talk first about how that relationship occurs using this slide. Okay, you've got, again, this relationship between legalizing marriage and a reduction in discrimination against LGBT populations. Is that the same relationship we spoke about a moment ago?
That's the same assumption, yes.
And how do you connect that to reduced violence and intimidation of children based on sexual orientation?
I believe that one aspect of that discrimination is the violence and intimidation that children experience at school.
Can you take a look at the exhibit in your binder marked PX8110, please? Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Is this a research brief you relied on in preparing your expert report in this case?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I move PX8110 into evidence.
No objection?
Very well. 810 is admitted.
Dr. Egan, what does this brief tell us about the number of students in California schools who are bullied based on their sexual orientation?
It states that over 200,000 students in California each year are bullied based on their actual or perceived sexual orientation.
Is there a relationship between that bullying and absenteeism in school?
The report says that there is. It states that nearly 109,000 school absences at the middle and high school levels in California are due to harassment based on actual or perceived sexual orientation.
Is there a link between that and school district revenue?
Yes. One of the bases for school district funding in California is attendance. And to the extent that attendance is less than it would be due to excessive absences, school district funding is less than it otherwise would be.
What is the total impact in California, if you know, of that absenteeism?
The report states that it costs California school districts at least $39.9 million per year.
Would any of that impact be felt in San Francisco?
I would expect that some of that would be felt in San Francisco.
Do you know how much?
I don't have an estimate of how much, and this report does not break out San Francisco.
And are there any other economic impacts that you could envision from pupil absenteeism due to bullying based on sexual orientation?
Well, the ultimate economic value of education is the progression of education, and that's compromised whenever absences reduce the quality of education that children receive, and that would have a long-term economic consequence.
Let's talk about the response to bullying. To the extent that school districts respond to bullying, does that also expend resources?
If that requires staff time and so forth, yes, that's additional resources spent in policing that behavior. Yes, that would result in a cost.
And I want to talk about responding to other kinds of sexual orientation discrimination as well. Could you take a look for me at exhibit numbers 672, PX 672, 673, 674, 675, and 676 in your binder, please?
Your Honor.
Yes.
These documents to which they refer appear to be hate crimes reports from California, and Dr. Egan did not refer to hate crimes in his expert report. We did not have an opportunity to depose him on that matter. These were not documents that were relied upon by him, so we would object to testimony on hate crimes as beyond the scope of his expert report.
Your Honor, Dr. Egan's report dealt generally with the fact of local governments and state governments responding to claims of discrimination. These are simply examples. And I think the limited scope of questioning that I'll conduct on this is going to alleviate any concerns that Mr. Patterson has.
Well, if the topic was covered in his report and in his deposition, I think it's appropriate for him to cover that topic generally in his testimony. I do not know that that opens the door to the introduction of these particular documents into evidence.
Your Honor, these documents were actually authenticated. They were...
Were they authenticated at his deposition?
Not at his deposition. They were authenticated not at his deposition. I'm stuck. Here we go, sorry. Where are we going? Your Honor, these documents?
Line 13.
Not at his deposition. They were authenticated by the state, by the Attorney General in discovery, subsequent to his deposition. Moreover, the 2008 hate crimes report was not released until late 2008, after Dr. Egan's deposition had occurred.
Well, obviously, that would not apply to 673, 674, 675, I suppose. Are these the kind of documents of which the court could take judicial notice? They appear to be produced by the California Department of Justice.
Yes, Your Honor, they were. And I believe that they are the kinds of documents of which the court can take judicial notice.
Any reason the court cannot take judicial notice of these government documents, Mr. Patterson?
No, Your Honor. But to the extent Dr. Egan is going to testify about them, the term hate crimes did not appear in his expert report. We did not depose him about hate crimes, so we have not had an opportunity to prepare to discuss that with Dr. Egan. To the extent Your Honor wants to take judicial notice of the documents, we would not have an objection to that.
Did I misunderstand you, Ms. Van Aken? You say...
Responding to discrimination, Your Honor. Responding to discrimination was the topic covered in the expert report, the costs of that. We did not specifically talk about hate crimes or hate crime
All right,
reports.
I think perhaps you should move on then.
Okay. Your Honor, may I talk about the 2008 report, which was had not been released by the Department of Justice?
Well, it deals with the same subject, doesn't it?
It does deal with the same subject, Your Honor.
I think Mr. Patterson's right. If you didn't cover this subject in either his report or in the deposition, I do not think it's appropriate to open up a whole new subject.
I would move on, Your Honor. Dr. Egan, let's talk about whether you saw any relationship in your report on, sorry. When you were preparing your report and informing your opinions in this case, did you reach any opinions about the impacts of wedding-related activity on San Francisco's budget?
Yes, I did.
What is that opinion, Dr. Egan?
Excuse me. In my opinion, if same-sex marriages were legalized, there would be more same-sex weddings in San Francisco. And consequently, those weddings would generate economic activity that would lead to more sales tax revenue and hotel tax revenue for San Francisco.
Dr. Egan, how many marriage licenses were issued in San Francisco in 2008?
Do you mean for same-sex marriages?
Yes.
The number I do vaguely remember. I believe it's around 5,100.
Okay, and were some of those marriage licenses issued to couples from out of state?
Yes.
Were some of them issued to couples from other countries?
I believe so, yes.
And at the time that those marriage licenses were being issued, were weddings also taking place?
Yes, they were.
What was the effect of that activity on San Francisco's revenues?
That has weddings as a source of expenditure have two kinds of basic effects on a local economy. There is the spending on the event and associated consumer spending that leads to sales tax revenue. Weddings can also draw in guests from out of town who stay in hotels and generate business for the hotel industry.
Is that activity that's been lost since same-sex marriage has been prohibited in San Francisco?
Yes, it is.
Let's talk about how that loss has come about and what you project if the prohibition were lifted. Can you just briefly describe for me the relationship between lifting that prohibition and then seeing additional sales tax or hotel tax revenue?
Yes, if the prohibition were lifted, we would see first more resident weddings by same-sex couples who currently reside in San Francisco. And we have projected that additional spending to be about $21 million per year annually. Particularly when we include, well, there will also be non-residents who come to San Francisco to marry. They will also have event-related spending for their weddings, although greatly reduced compared to the residents. They will also generate per diem spending as visitors to the city, and they will generate hotel business because they will be staying at hotels. The third set of new economic activity associated would be out-of-town guests, which we have assumed would largely come for resident weddings. They will generate per diem spending, and they will also help fill hotel rooms. So it's a combination of the event spending on the wedding itself and the per diem spending of visitors that generates the sales tax revenue. The additional hotel rooms generates hotel tax revenue.
What's the magnitude of the effect of all this in your estimate?
The spending effect is on the order of $35 million. The hotel room revenue is on the order of $2.5 million, and the tax revenue we project at $1.7 million a year for sales tax and about $0.9 million a year for hotel tax.
Speaking generally, what did you base these calculations on?
Well, we based it on the experience that San Francisco saw with same-sex weddings in 2008.
Is this a short-term or a long-term projection for annual increased revenue from sales and hotel taxes?
I guess I would characterize it as a short-term projection. It's reasonable for me to think that if the same-sex marriage is legalized again, we will see a similar level of activity that we saw the last time. I wouldn't expect that rate to continue forever, however.
But continuing into the future, into the long term, do you expect some level of activity?
Oh, certainly, I would. Even if every same-sex couple who resides in San Francisco, for example, were able to get married and was married, there are still new relationships developing, couples forming, people moving to San Francisco who don't live here now. And so there will always be marriages going on into the future at some level, and therefore you would see some economic benefit.
Okay. Let's turn now to federal income tax benefits with respect to city revenue that might result from the lifting of the prohibition on the marriage of same-sex couples. Do you see a relationship there?
Yes, I do.
And what is that relationship?
If marriage for same-sex couples were permitted, that would affect their federal income tax burden in a way that would put more revenue, would result in income tax savings for them. They would have, as a result, more money, some of which they would spend in San Francisco. And that higher spending in San Francisco would generate more sales tax for the city and for the county.
Are you assuming any changes to federal law?
The question was?
Are you assuming any changes to federal law?
It's my understanding that the Defense of Marriage Act would have to be changed in order to allow this.
I see. For these couples to see this income tax benefit?
Yes. That would be an additional requirement before this benefit could be realized.
What is the potential magnitude of this benefit to San Francisco?
To the best of my recollection, the average savings, some same-sex couples would experience an income tax savings, and some would actually have a higher income tax burden if they were married. But the average works out to, I believe, a $440 a year or so savings. And if that were multiplied by a reasonable estimate of the number of same-sex married couples we might see in San Francisco, and they spent all of that in San Francisco on taxable goods, we would see as much as $74,000 a year in additional revenue.
Would the state see any additional revenue?
Yes. Again, the state gets a larger percentage of sales tax than the city does, so they would see an increase in sales tax revenue as well.
And assuming an effect like this, would this be true for other federal benefits that same-sex couples could receive, such as Social Security, survivor disability benefits?
To the extent that their benefits would increase if they were married, then yes, they would have more revenue to spend in San Francisco, and the city would receive additional tax revenue.
Dr. Egan, I want to turn now to talk about San Francisco's Equal Benefits Ordinance. Can you take a look at the exhibit marked PX 811, please? 811. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
What is this?
It's a municipal code from San Francisco that details the Human Rights Commission in the city and its policies concerning discrimination. And Chapter 12B details the Equal Benefits Ordinance.
Is this something that you reviewed in preparing in reaching opinions in this case?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I move PX 0811 into evidence.
There being no objection, 811 is in.
Dr. Egan, does the Equal Benefits Ordinance require the Human Rights Commission to investigate discrimination complaints?
Yes, it does.
And does the Human Rights Commission also have responsibilities with respect to San Francisco's contracting?
Yes, it does.
What are those responsibilities?
In general, it is the city's policy is to regulate contracting in ways that do not promote discrimination and actively discourage discrimination.
So what is your understanding of the goal or the intent of the Equal Benefits Ordinance?
The Equal Benefits Ordinance is intended to redress discrimination and discourage discrimination by requiring contractors for the city to provide the same benefits to domestic partners that they provide to married couples.
Dr. Egan, is it costly to the city to administer the Equal Benefits Ordinance in some way?
I believe the annual administrative cost is in the order of $1 million a year for the city.
To the extent that other governments investigate claims of discrimination, would they also incur costs?
From our Equal Benefits Ordinance or in general?
No, in general.
Yes.
And did the city incur costs in defending the Equal Benefits Ordinance from legal challenges?
Yes, the city did.
Dr. Egan, I want to turn to the issue of the city's contracting costs. Under the Equal Benefits Ordinance, do you see any relationship between combating discrimination, as you told me, as the purpose of the Equal Benefits Ordinance and San Francisco's contracting costs?
Yes, I do.
What is that relationship, Dr. Egan?
I believe that if same-sex marriage were legalized, the city would see reduced contracting costs and lower bids on many of its RFPs and proposals.
Can you tell me how that would work?
Yes, I believe that if same-sex marriage were legalized, more companies would extend benefits to same-sex couples who are married. This would lead companies to perceive or experience an actual, a lower compliance cost to San Francisco's EBO. Since they are already providing the benefits to married couples, it would be easier for them to comply with the Equal Benefits Ordinance. If that were the case, I would expect that some companies who are either not eligible to contract with the city or who are deterred from bidding with the city because they perceive the EBO as a deterrent would no longer experience that deterrent. And consequently, we would see an expanded competition among contractors for doing business with the city.
Do you currently believe that there is a reduced pool of contractors competing for the city's business because of the EBO?
Yes, to the extent that it's a deterrent, yes.
And what would be the result of this increased response and competition that you've described?
Some of the companies that are either not eligible or are deterred may very well be the lowest bidder or the preferred bidder, and consequently that tends to inflate the city's contracting costs.
I see. Can you quantify what the magnitude of this inflation is presently?
Well, it's very difficult to know what the bids of the company who are deterred from building would be, so I can't provide a quantitative estimate of that. But it's sort of basic economics that the more competitors you have, the more price pressure you have.
What's the potential impact of lowering contracting costs for the city if the EBO is perceived to be easier to comply with?
Are you asking for a quantitative estimate of savings?
Yeah, at least potentially.
Well, contracting costs are a significant expense for the city, over $2 billion a year. So even a very small reduction in costs due to regulatory change regarding how easy it is to contract with the city could result in a significant savings. At 1% savings, for example, would result in a 1% reduction in costs would result in a $21 million savings for the city.
Is that an annual figure?
Yes, it is.
And assume with me that there is no further discrimination based on sexual orientation in marriage, and assume with me that the San Francisco Board of Supervisors thereafter repeals the Equal Benefits Ordinance. What would then be the contracting cost to San Francisco from the Equal Benefits Ordinance?
Well, in that case, it would be none.
I thought so. Dr. Egan, I want to show you a last slide, a last demonstrative that's entitled Summary of Impacts, Quantifiable and Non-Quantifiable, and ask you if that reflects an accurate summary of the opinions that you've rendered in this case.
Yes, it is.
And what is the import of this distinction between quantitative and non-quantitative, or quantifiable and non-quantifiable?
I think the importance of quantifiable impacts, to discuss them first, is that by the usual methods that we would do in the Office of Economic Analysis, it's clear to me that Proposition 8 has a negative material economic impact on San Francisco. That is to say, the city is losing more than $10 million a year in economic activity. And as I've quantified it here, it's at least $2.6 million simply from hotel and sales tax revenue that we're not getting from same-sex weddings. And so the import is, although there are many, many impacts, we can quantify impacts that would, if it were local legislation, lead me to think that it would have a material economic impact.
Just so I understand what you just said, there is a total level of economic activity that must occur for it to be material. Is that right?
That's right.
Not necessarily a total revenue effect.
That's right. Although the large economic activity leads to a relatively large revenue impact.
I see. Oh, I see. So when you were speaking earlier about the $35 million for wedding-related activity, for instance, is that material, in your opinion?
Yes, that exceeds $10 million.
Okay. And now tell me about this distinction, the non-quantifiable piece.
Most of the impacts that I detailed in my report are not quantifiable, at least not as readily quantifiable as the ones on the left. But I wouldn't want to minimize their impact or suggest that they were small, particularly in the long term. What we're really talking about in the non-quantifiable impacts are the long-term advantages of marriage as an institution and the long-term costs of discrimination as a way that weakens people's productivity and integration into the labor force. Whether it's weakening their education because they're discriminated against at school or leading them to excessive reliance on behavioral and other health services, these are impacts that are hard to quantify, but they can wind up being extremely powerful. How much healthier you are over your lifetime, how much wealth you generate because you are in a partnership. So it seems reasonable to me to think that in the long term, these are the impacts that would matter for San Francisco, even if we can't attach a number to them now.
Thank you, Dr. Egan. Nothing further.
Very well. Mr. Patterson, you may cross-examine.